Hey everyone, you're watching Kickback and Chat with Amber Pickens. Today I have the privilege and honor of interviewing author, producer, activist, survivor, and father, Shaka Senghor. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my honor.
Thank you. After meeting you the other night at your screening for release, I just knew I couldn't let you leave the city without being able to sit and chat with you. So thank you for being here. So you have a top-selling book, Righting My Wrongs. Your TED Talk was one of the highest viewed. You're featured on Oprah's Super Soul Sunday. You're featured in the documentary 13th on Netflix. Yeah, shout out to Ava. And now you have this amazing new docu-series release. Wow. But before we get into all these accomplishments and all the amazing things that you're doing, I want to just take us back a little bit and talk about some of the events leading up to these moments. So before you served your 19 years in prison, you were shot 3 times at the age of 17. Now after that, you had no therapy and true guidance, and then you were sent right back to the neighborhood that you were shot in. Can you share with us what was the aftermath of being shot leading up to being sentenced for 19 years in prison?
Yeah, I mean, like many of the young men who grew up in inner cities who are victims of gun violence, there was no treatment for PTSD. I didn't even know what PTSD was until years later. But when I left the hospital, I left with this volatile cocktail of emotions. I was angry, I was paranoid, and I felt that in order to find some type of balance, that I had to start carrying a gun just to protect myself. And I began to run this narrative in my head that said that if I found myself in conflict again, where I felt threatened, that I would shoot first as opposed to waiting to see what the outcome would be. And tragically, 16 months later, I got into a conflict, and that it started with an argument that escalated very quickly. And before you know it, I fired several shots and tragically caused the man's death.
What was the first thoughts that went through your head when you heard that you were sentenced for 19 years?
But I was sentenced to 17 years, 17 to 40 years in prison, and I just thought my life was over. I didn't feel like there was anything on the other side of it. I mean, at 19, you can barely see life beyond 2 weeks, let alone 2 decades. And so when I went to prison, I was just bitter. I was angry. I felt hopeless. I didn't feel like um, that I could become anything other than that prison number that I was given when I was sentenced.
Within those 19 years, you had to serve 7 years in solitary confinement. I've heard that some people don't even make it through the first month of solitary confinement. So, how did you make it through? What kept you going and focused on the light at the end of the tunnel during that time?
Being able to read books and being able to read about what solitary confinement was designed to do to you really helped me navigate my way through a very tough circumstance, a tough situation. And the level of mental illness in solitary confinement is unbelievable. The level of brutality and dehumanization. And I knew that for me, I just had to take things moment by moment. And once I realized that by taking it moment by moment, I could focus on the purpose instead of the pain, that I can get through and come out on the other side of that. And for me, the purpose was just to make it out without being impacted by the mental assault that was happening all around me. And so I just stayed focused. I wrote, I journaled, I read books. I figured out, to start writing down my goals and my dreams and just think of like what life could be, and that kept me going.
You've also discussed how you received a letter in solitary confinement. What was that letter? Who was it from?
So I got a letter while I was in solitary from my son, my oldest son. I have a young 5-year-old now, but this was my oldest son at the time. He was around 11 years old, and he wrote me this letter telling me that his mother had told him while I was in prison. And it was that reading that letter was just devastating as a father to know that my son was going to grow up and look at me as some type of monster or some type of, you know, person that he would be afraid of. And I knew then that I had a responsibility to turn my life around and take the necessary steps to ensure that I gave him what I owe him, which is a father he can be proud of.
I think you also discussed that you received a letter from the victim's mother. What did that letter mean to you?
Yeah, so I received a letter from the woman who played a role in raising him. She's the godmother of the victim, and I was about 6 years into my sentence, maybe 5 or 6 years into my sentence, when I got that letter, and it was a letter of forgiveness. And you know, when I got it, I didn't know what to do with the grace that she had just extended to me. But what it did do for me is it opened me up emotionally to the possibility that I was forgivable. Um, but it would take several years before I was able to fully embrace that.
Also, I thought something that was really just amazing is that you talked about having mentors in prison. So, what does a mentor in prison look like?
So my mentors in prison are all serving life sentences or very long sentences. Some of them at this point have over 4 decades in prison, and they were just really wise men who had grew up in that environment. Some have been in since they've been kids, basically 16, 17 years old, and they're just full of wisdom, full of insights about life, and they challenged me in ways that nothing else had. They challenged me to read, and after I would read books, we would have these deep, profound discussions. And I was like any other young guys on the cell block where when they were sharing things with me, I didn't always apply them right then. But when I decided to apply them, I had them available. And so I always pay homage to them through my work and through my efforts to mentor other young men, but also in the work I do in the criminal justice space. Like, these are my friends. These are men who I grew up with and grew up alongside of. And so I feel a real responsibility to always represent them in the highest light.
That's really incredible. And so, I know all this helped you with creating your Righting My Wrongs. So, what was it like to just write this? Why was it important to you to write a book about all of this?
Yeah, so I started writing when I was in solitary confinement, and I actually write fiction. So I write detective stories and stories that are written in the urban landscape because I felt like if I can write stories that were relatable to young people, that I could just drop these jewels of wisdom that they'll be able to apply. Once I got out of prison, I started mentoring and working with other young men and women, and I realized that we were labeling our young people without understanding what they were going through. We were judging them unfairly, and I remember being that young, confused teenager that wished I had somebody who just understood or somebody who was just willing to listen. And so, people would ask me about my story. They were like, "Oh, you're so articulate and intelligent. How did you end up in prison?" And I knew that I'm like these kids that I was working with and mentoring. And so I decided to write my memoir, Writing My Wrongs. And it was one of the hardest books I had to write because I had to deal with a lot of the personal pain. I had to write about things that were uncomfortable. I had to write about the relationship with my mother, which wasn't, the healthiest of relationships, and the type of abuse I had experienced at her hands. And, you know, it's one thing to experience it as a child, but as adults reflect back on it. Sometimes you don't want to talk about those things because you don't want to hurt. My mother in a very different space now, and I didn't want to hurt her feelings, but I knew that I owed these kids the truth. And I know that if you're going to fix something, you have to be honest about it. You have to acknowledge that it exists. And so, I had to dig into areas in my life that were really not that comfortable. Yeah.
And I read in Righting My Wrongs that you sold the first copy in the parking lot as soon as you were released. So who did you sell this first copy to, and why did you want to sell this copy to this person?
Well, the first book, it wasn't a copy of Writing My Wrongs. It was a copy of one of my novels called Crack, Volume 1. Um, and I knew that when I got out that I had a responsibility as an entrepreneur to, take over the sales of my books. And there was a young man who was coming home the same time I was coming home. And he was really like excited to support me. And, he really wanted to read the book. And he was like, as soon as we get out, if, the people who are picking you up bring a book with me, I want to buy one. And so I made my first sale in the parking lot.
So cool. I loved reading. I was like, you got right to it. But that's important because, like you were saying, it's uncomfortable to talk about it, but it's impacted so many young men and women. So that's awesome. So since then, you shared your story on TED Talk, and it was entitled "The Worst Deeds Don't Define You," which I remember one of my friends actually posted that on Facebook in 2015. So I thought that was really cool. And you've done so many interviews around America, making sure that people are aware of what's going on. And something I learned the other day that I thought was a fun fact is that on the one of my favorite shows, Queen Sugar, Ralph Angel was inspired by you. So how does that feel to just see that you're inspiring characters on hit shows?
I mean, that was like one of the most humbling moments when I found out it was at the premiere of Queen Sugar, and I had been invited by the OWN network, and I didn't know if I was gonna make it because I was traveling, and so when I got there, everybody was like, "Oh, we're so excited you're here, and tell us what you think, and check out this character Ralph Angel," and I'm like, "Cool," because I didn't have a heads up, And so I watched it, and when I was watching, I was like, "Wow, that looks familiar." Like relationship with him and his son, and him, having a felony and trying to navigate his way through life. And then at the end of the premiere, the OWN team was like, you gotta come meet Kofi, right?" And so they walked me down to where Kofi was actually coming out. And he was walking out with Oprah. And as soon as Oprah saw me, she like lit up like a light and was like, "I want to introduce you to Kofi, right?" And we had this beautiful exchange. I still had a picture of it. It was a beautiful exchange where when she was introducing me to Kofi and telling him my story, like he got emotional, like, and I guess it was just him understanding like this character is much more than just a TV character. This is real life, And one of the things that Oprah told us is she was like, when you have an issue that you want to change, using art is the way to go about doing that. When you have this platform, and so it's just a beautiful moment. I actually need to get this picture framed because I believe Kofi's going to go on and be a giant in the industry, and it's just a special moment to know that you can utilize the pain from your life to help so many people through art, and to be on a platform like that and to work with Oprah on stuff like that just really means a lot.
And speaking of the arts and it really reflecting everything, it makes me think of one of my favorite quotes by Nina Simone saying, it's our responsibility that our art reflects the times that we're in. So I think that it's amazing and it is uncomfortable for a lot of people, but it's what's going on in the world today. So now we're leading up to Released, this incredible docu-series about people's redemption stories. And I could not stop crying the other night. I'm about to start crying again because just it was so raw and so true and just honest about what everybody was going through, because it's like it's not just about what you're going through in prison but what's happening afterwards.
I mean, the beauty of Release to me is that it really explores a part of the incarceration conversation that we hadn't been looking at. Like, we know that there's 2.2 million people incarcerated. We know 10,000 men and women come home every week on parole or probation. But what we never talk about is the families that they're coming back to. We never talk about the families that suffer along with them while they're serving their sentences. And to be able to explore that from both perspectives and see, like, how deeply impacted these families are by their loved ones being incarcerated. The relationships between children, how hard it is to navigate that once you're released after 2 decades. It's just a powerful, powerful experience that happens all the time. You know, every room I've been in, and I've asked people, um, do you know somebody who's incarcerated? Do you have a loved one, a friend? Almost throughout the room, somebody knows somebody. And so this is a real issue. And we wanted to just explore what is it like that first 90 days when you're coming home. You're trying to reestablish yourself. You're looking for that second chance. And what are the obstacles you run into? What are the things that your family runs into? And, in watching it, even though I've worked on the show and I've seen these stories over and over, literally almost every time I watch it, I get teary-eyed. And part of it is because some of these stories validate my experiences and they're showing things that I wasn't quite able to articulate. Like there's a scene in the first episode when a gentleman named Kevin goes into the store.
I was going to talk about because Kevin had me crying the whole time.
Yeah, and in that moment, I felt so validated because I carried all of these emotions. And people would always say, well, just, it'll be all right, it'll be okay. without even understanding or coming close to understanding. And that's where part of the struggle at is when you've been through such a traumatic experience and people say that they understand and they're well intentioned, a lot of times it dismisses your feelings and it validates it. And so to see that show up for me was just really, really important.
One of the things about Kevin that just had me crying the hardest is when he walked in the souvenir shop and he was just amazed by the chips and candy and things that I walk by every day and I'm like, oh, let me just ignore this. I'm trying to stay skinny, or but he was just so happy to be free, or how he was looking at the chicken and waffles that was on the table, like, wow, I'm just so happy to be here. What was it like for you when you had your first meal?
So it's interesting. I was supposed to have come home to a meal at some fancy restaurant, and unfortunately, the restaurant was closed. And so by the time that happened, I was starving, and I was like, I seen a sign called Subway, and I saw a commercial. I'd never had Subway before, and I was like, let's go in there. I could just get a sandwich out of there. So my first actual meal was like a chicken sandwich from Subway. So it wasn't great chicken and waffles, which would have been amazing. Um, but it was okay. It was like I'm home, I'm free. And then later on that evening, I had my stepmother made lasagna, which was one of my favorite meals that she used to cook. So I had that and got the chance to just enjoy time with my family.
So what is your true definition of freedom? What does it look like to you?
So freedom, it's interesting that my definition of freedom has changed over the years. And when I did the interview with Oprah on Super Soul Sunday, her and I were having this conversation afterward, after the interview, and she was just kind of telling me about some of her practices, what keeps her grounded, and then she just was saying, she said, that to her freedom is waking up every day and deciding what you want to do with your life. And I was like, wow, that's powerful, because a lot of us wake up and we have to go to work or we have to go to school or we have to do this. And, it really reframed my thinking about what does it really mean to be free. And so I try to live my life in a way where I decide what I want to do every day when I wake up, because for 19 years, somebody else was deciding those things for me. And now as a person who is fully capable and, I have choices and I can make the choices that I want to make, I just try to live my life in a way that affords me that opportunity to say, you know what, I don't want to do this today, or I do want to do this, or I don't want to do anything today, and be perfectly fine with it. So it's a blessing to be in a position where I can pretty much kind of dictate what I want to do with my days.
That's amazing. So what's next for you?
So the next thing I'm working on, I have a monologue show I'm working on called The Sale, which I'm really, really excited about. And part of it is, I've shared my story on various platforms, on pretty much most of the biggest platforms you could be on as a speaker. Um, and at times that's emotionally exhausting. And then there's so many other stories that have to be told. We live in an age where prison culture is popular in media. You have Orange is the New Black, you have the various lockup shows and jail shows, um, and I just feel like, while I think those stories do shine some light, like Orange is the New Black did something that I thought was really brilliant, which is really introduce the concept of humor inside prison. And I remember when that show first came out, people were just blowing me up like, what do you think of this show? What do you think of this show? And I think a lot of them wanted me to be like, oh, it sucks, it's not real, it's not realistic. But I explained to them that you cannot make it through a traumatic experience without a sense of humor. And laughter is really important when you're dealing with difficulties and hard circumstances. But with that being said, I feel like there are stories that are not being told and that need to be told, and that if we're gonna really shift the culture around uh, prison, we have to be honest about what that looks like. And that inspired me to create this monologue show called The Cell. And I was very intentional about creating it as a stage piece because I feel like television is great right now. Some amazing shows coming out. I didn't want to create this as a show because I feel like sometimes with shows, you can get caught up in all of the artistic components of it, and I mean that's great television. I think that's important, but this I really wanted people to focus on the words. As a writer, I'm very intentional about every word that I use when I'm writing, and I really wanted people to just focus on what the person is saying. And the coolest part is that the cell is narrating the piece, So, the cell has this perspective that nobody else has because it has a purview that nobody else can see once a person is inside that cell. So, I'm really excited about that. I have a couple other shows that I'm working on, I'm producing in various stages. Um, but I'm super excited about utilizing my creativity and my artistry to create stories and programs and shows that really matter and make sense on different levels.
Ever do more stuff in front of the camera?
So would I ever do more stuff in front of the camera? Um, I'm open to it. People wanted me to do, when I first started talking about the cell monologue, they really wanted me to do it as a one-man show. And I may eventually go on to do a one-man show about something different, but I don't know. I'm open. I did tell my friend though, J.J. Abrams, uh, that he got to get me on one of the one of the new shows.
Yeah, he's great.
Yeah, so yeah, I'm looking for some cameos somewhere. I might slide up on Queen Sugar one day. Never know. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. What are any of just last words of wisdom you would like to leave with us today?
I guess my words of wisdom would be around release. This show, this series, is such a powerful tool for those who are struggling with having incarcerated loved ones. Watch it, share it, really enter it, the space with an open heart and an open mind. I can guarantee you that there's somebody in the show that's going to move you. There's somebody in the show that's going to remind you of a loved one, of a friend, of an aunt, an uncle. And if we can really embrace that part of the show and carry that out into the rest of our lives, I think the world will be a better place.
Well, thank you so much, Shaka. Thank you for all this wisdom. This has been so incredible. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in to Kickback and Chat with Amber Pickens. Have a great day. Bye.